I'm talking today with Gil Ayal, my colleague at Columbia University in the Department of Sociology, where he's a professor of sociology. Gil is the author of a wonderful book. I have it here.
Uh-huh.
The Crisis of Expertise.
Mhm.
And the topic could not be more timely. Gil, thanks very much for talking with us. We can talk about expertise, about testing, about what you see from how you're thinking in science and technology studies, about
Mhm.
what's happening in the world. So thank you very much for talking with me.
Thanks, David, for inviting me to do this. This is great. I actually wanted to start, from put to the test, because, I read your introductory essay a few weeks ago when you sent it, and I really like the analytical elegance of the framework. But rereading it today, I think it accumulated, added weight and added force. It was just this morning that the UN Secretary General released a report and about the world's response to the coronavirus. And the first sentence of this report is that this is the greatest test that the UN has ever faced. So, but what I felt about this is that obviously we all use it in a metaphorical sense. And when he says this is the greatest test, he means it in a way that we would mean it in ordinary language. This is an ordeal that we'll have to go through, and that will test us in the sense that it will test what we're made of, both as individuals and as societies and as institutions. Were we prepared? Did we know how to deal with this? Did we protect, the weak and the vulnerable? All of this. But I think what you have in your introduction in the edited volume is a suggestion to think about this not just metaphorically. Yes, that the sociology of testing suggests that you could think about this idea that we are being tested now, not just as this metaphorical ordeal we're going through. So that's why I found it extremely topical, extremely contemporary, right for this moment.
Oh, good. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and you reread it, so even all the better. Yeah. So what do you make of this idea now of like society being put to the test? Is that makes sense to talk in that kind of language? What do you think?
Well, I do think it makes sense because for a variety of reasons. I think we are being put to the test in the most obvious way in which, we had systems in place to respond to this virus, or to, more precisely, to what's the term, newly emerging pathogens. This is something that virologists and biosecurity experts have been warning about for the last 20 years. And we had, previous iterations with H1N1 and with SARS. We thought we were prepared, and then it turned out we are not. So we probably failed the test. Then there is another test, which is, a moral test, right? Because we are awash with suggestions that, as Trump puts it, the medicine is worse than the disease. Maybe we should just, restart the economy. Guess a few people would die, but a few people die every year, et cetera, et cetera. This is something I feel strongly. We have to resist the moral trap of the equivalency there. So we are tested in this way. And then finally, I'd say, we are tested twice. We're tested by two things. We're tested by the virus, obviously. And as I say, we partially failed. But we are also tested by our own response to it, in the sense that probably the most overwhelming fact right now is less the virus, but the form of power that has been unleashed to counter it. right? The social distancing, the semi-global quarantine, the extension of testing, all these forms of power that have suddenly have always been there, but we are now face to face with them, and they are of our own making, and yet not completely of our own making. And we are tested because they are formidable forms of power. They are intrusive, and they are dangerous. And some people immediate reaction is, it doesn't matter, they save us, so let's just go with it. And some other people, mostly critical intellectuals, reaction is, this is dangerous, you got to put it on hold. Look what is done in the name of this power, and things are being done. Orban is suspending all sorts of democratic protections in Hungary. Not that there were many to begin with. Things like that are happening everywhere. But that too, I feel, is an overreaction. Mm-hmm. So we are tested in the sense of, how do we resist a form of power, but from within it, without, completely refusing it in a somewhat childish gesture, but recognizing what is dangerous and what is not dangerous, what needs to be resisted now and what not to be resisted now, etc.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. One of the ways I've been thinking about this giving up of our freedoms, the right to assembly, privacy, and things like that, is we don't give them all up. Or, for example, like, we are willing, I think, to concede that we may not have complete freedom of assembly in physical space. All the more important to have freedom of assembly in virtual space.
Yes.
Unmonitored, mm-hmm. Unsurveyed.
Yes.
So we're not giving up every right. Maybe some rights need to be more strongly enforced, as we acknowledge that in the interest of public health, and for all of us, that is, we're willing to have an infringement on some of our freedoms, but we will be very, very vigilant about protecting other ones. I think that is one of the ways that I found that I can deal with this problem, that we must be able to understand that there are infrastructures being put in place now, which are necessary, but could be abused at some time in the immediate present or sometime in the future. Yeah. No.
Exactly. So let's indeed talk about testing, right? Because this form of power is a testing power. It's a power that works by promising, taking care of individuals, their health and well-being. But in order to do that, that power says, we have to test you. We have to determine whether you are a danger to others, whether you are in danger, are you risky, to whom, etc., etc. And that is clearly a potentially dangerous proposition, and yet an absolutely necessary one as well. So so how do we develop, ways of thinking about, what kinds of testing extensions are ones that we should be wary about, and others that maybe we should accept. And doing that, I think the sociology of testing is really useful, because it reminds us that these tests are, indeed, as you said before, are going to stay with us, that they're not just testing something that exists, they create a new thing. Mm-hmm. And to the extent that they create the new thing, we have to evaluate if this new thing is something that we want to stay with. And is it likely that this is going to stay with us, and etc. So just as a comparison, I'm reading a report that in Germany, there talks about the idea that serological tests, not available yet, but will be available, could determine whether somebody is not just whether they're ill or not, but they actively could infect others or not. And on the basis of that would be issued certificates for whether one can return to work or not. Mm-hmm. This is obviously quite dangerous, and yet I think, first of all, very likely to happen.
Mhm.
And second, while it is, a new way of splitting the population, and in that sense,
Classifying the population.
exactly classifying, creating new categories, new. If Ulrich Beck was still with us, he would say new risk categories, right? These are the new classes. So that is dangerous, but at the same time, one has to say, look, this is a fairly reasonable way of trying to climb our way out of this. Then you compare this with, what I hear in Israel, that they have been developing. I mean, they develop a series of tracking mechanisms. So everybody is tracked by now. The information is coordinated by the General Security Service, together with the Health Ministry. And so there are, you can have an app that will tell you if you are near a person who is infected. Turns out those apps don't work very well. They give false alarms, false positives. But the worst part of this is the idea of turning this into an algorithm. So there's a new suggestion to develop a system that is no longer dependent on actual testing. It uses an algorithm that collates behavioral data, locational data, social network data, phone data, in order to generate a 1 to 10 estimate of how likely is it that you or this other person is infected. That, I think, is super dangerous, and it's a form of testing that, is out there in the sense that not for diseases, but in other ways, risk scores, etc. But this is something I feel strongly that we would need to resist.
Yeah. Well, Gil, your book, The Crisis of Expertise, there must be ways in which expertise has been and is being put to the test. How do you see that now these days?
Oh, I mean, you were the one who sort of asked me this question a few weeks ago, and I'm immensely grateful for that, because up till then I was sort of passively observing, but now I've been trying indeed to bring to bear some of the tools that I have used in order to think about the crisis of expertise, about this moment. So experts are being tested, absolutely. I mean, just this morning, it was announced that the FDA has given emergency use approval to this anti-malaria drug to be used for the treatment of coronavirus patients. Let me remind you, there was a moment, I think about 10 days ago, a dramatic moment at the White House lawn, in which Trump was standing there, touting this anti-malaria drug. And then Fauci steps in and said, this is premature. We do not think that this is this has been tested. This is just anecdotal evidence. And what's going back in Fauci's mind is, you're saying this now, this drug is going to disappear from the pharmacies, and it's being used, anti-malaria, but it's really used actually for rheumatoid arthritis, which is, a huge patient population that without it suffers quite a great deal of pain. So in the back of his mind is, this is going to have this impact. And so there's this dramatic moment in which the expert contradicts the politician contradicts the expert, and they're both presenting themselves to the public. Whom should you trust, right? Now, the FDA gave this approval. It doesn't mean that, that Trump necessarily won this struggle. It will be ultimately decided in public opinion, public sphere. But what is clear right now is that, there is a collusion in conflict, if you will, because they're both absolutely dependent on one another. Fauci cannot, achieve his goals without Trump. Trump, cannot do anything without the experts. And in fact, we know that he has stepped back from, announcing that we're open to business because of what he's been told by the expert. But at the same time, they're also struggling over the matter of whom should we trust. And my book sort of indicates that we are now at a point in the process of 40 years in which trust in expert has been declining, even as the dependence on them has been increasing. And that's what makes the crisis, is this tug of push and pull. You mistrust the most the person you also need the most, and nothing like an epidemic brings us to the fore as much. We are predisposed to trust the expert at this moment because this is a frame of emergency. It's a break in time in which we are looking to the people that we can trust, and yet at the same time we are always being reminded of the limitations of expertise. I mean, not just the anti-malaria drug, but the matter of masks. For weeks for now, we have been told you do not need to wear a mask. Don't wear a mask. Now the the CDC is rethinking it and perhaps will come up with new instructions that saying wear anything. A bandana, a balaclava, whatever, wear it. Now behind it is a completely different calculation, which is it's not to protect you, it's to protect others. And it is because we figured out that it's not fine air particles, but large droplets. So that would actually be useful. But all of this disappears. All that people will see is the experts told us not to do this. Now they're telling us to do this. They'll keep changing their mind. Why should we trust them? So this is in the balance now. It's not obvious that people will mistrust the FDA and the CDC. It's not obvious that they will trust them.
Yeah. There's the nice, I think it's an epigram of your book, which I liked so much. The one from Nicholas Luhmann, or maybe it's not. No, it is it is the epigram. I'll read it. I think it's so appropriate for this moment. An expert is a specialist to whom one can put questions that he is unable to answer. Yeah. So the expert is the one you ask a question. He says, I don't know. Which is the same way of saying, if you leave it up to the experts, you are leaving it up to people, some of whom will say, I think this, and others will say, no, I think that. Or the same expert, one week will say, well, the science tells me this, and the next week, literally, maybe in this case, it may be different. Yeah. One of the things, in this light, I've been thinking about sort of basic science technology studies 101. Maybe it's even especially kind of actor network theory. Like, who represents the virus? Yeah. The virus is an actor in our society. It might even think about it as a political actor. It's acting in our politics. Who is authorized to represent it? It's invisible. Really think about Pasteur. They're showing making the germ visible in these demonstrations. And we don't have demonstrations in the street, but all the while we're reading these models showing us this is what the virus looks like. This is how it behaves. This is how it's behaving. It's a parasite. So it needs us to behave, right? It's not like, it's an actor that just does its thing regardless of what we do. And somehow even these models of its behavior can affect, because we are the ones who can spread it, how it operates in society. So experts are making these representations, demonstrations of the virus. Yeah. But we have a polity in which there are also politicians who can make their representations. It's no worse than the flu. These kinds of things. And that is really puts to the test the relationship between science and its obligations to represent things that we cannot see, and politicians whose obligations are to also make representations of society and what's happening in it. This is an exciting moment, I think, for science and technology studies. Yeah.
Yes. I think, yeah, it probably will give rise to a whole new sub-discipline within science and technology studies. I mean, I think it will also, it will also draw attention to simulations. Yes, because when you say who represents the virus, it's even more complex than that, obviously, because it's who represents the future of the virus, right? Its future trajectory, and you can see here the same issues that come up with climate change debate, because at the end of the day, who represents climate change? Models, right? Simulation models. And those are, in the words of one of the Republican senators back in 1984, this is not sound science. You're telling me not about facts, but about what, assumptions or models or speculations, right? And so this is part of the crisis of expertise, is that indeed a lot of science today, virology and climate science, is composed of simulations that represent the future of a virus, the temperatures, et cetera, and they open themselves up as a result to multiple disputes. And one of the things that you could see here that is similar in the climate change debate is the fact that means that not only the scientists with subject matter expertise can speak about it and represent the virus or climate change, because anybody with expertise in models, simulations, statistics, big data can consider themselves, entitled to come up with their own simulations. And they do that. You have the internet right now is awash with people with data expertise who are making certain assumptions and then producing their own models and representing, and some of them do the work of, telling us, look, the reality is that probably there's millions and millions of people already infected that have already recovered, and this is in fact a lot, a lot less lethal than you think, et cetera, so we should go back to work, et cetera. There's a lot of that going around.
Mm-hmm. And I think these models are not, some of them have somewhat performative effects. The more you believe one, for example, and the politicians make decisions on its basis, the more the world may come to look like the model, because the models are a part of the reality. They are not just out there not affecting the world, and in fact, the behavior of the virus. We think the virus behaves independently of the model, but that's not the case in here, because the virus doesn't do anything unless it's got human beings to help spread it. And our ideas about how it spreads can affect what happens for good or for bad. So we're at a very important moment.
We are, and also, yes, this modeling or simulation knowledge has extended itself. Now we are in a moment of what Anthony Giddens used to call the double hermeneutic, when this set of concepts is now spread, because you have Como, for example, telling us good news, because I could see that the rate of increase has decreased. Namely, if you're a naive person looking at numbers, you just see increase. But Como is already thinking in terms of a simulation models that models the exponential growth, and he sees this is not exponential growth. So obviously, he's told by some of his advisors, but he's able to explain this to people. And everybody speaks in terms of flattening the curve, right? what is flattening the curve? Is that a real curve? It's a simulated projected curve, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that will have performative effects.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.